Okay, thank you everyone, and I echo Audrey's thanks to those of you who've stuck it out to the bitter end, and we are going to try and do something a little different for this last session that will involve you being, we hope, very engaged and participative, which reflects the title of the session really, which is cross-fertilization. So what is cross-fertilization, you might ask? Good question, and it's one that we're going to throw right back to you. I know what I think it is, my fellow panelists know what they think it is, but we would like to take just a few minutes at the start of this session for you to, in small groups with people nearby, just spend a couple of minutes talking about what you think cross-fertilization means. So, talk. Enough talking now, thank you very much. I would like to invite those of you who are sitting way at the back maybe to come forward a little bit, because this is not a packed hall, and we really do want you to be engaged and interacting with us. So if you're willing to move forward a bit, if you're at the back, that would be great. I want to find out a little bit about what you all think cross-fertilization is. First of all, I'm going to take the chair's privilege and tell you what I think it is, which is, I guess, a form of organised serendipity, if you like, and I like saying that because serendipity is one of my favourite words. But it's about finding those connections between people, articles, organisations, whatever it might be, and finding ways to bring them together, perhaps in unexpected ways that you wouldn't have thought of normally. And I think that part of what we want to talk about today is how we can move that from something that just happens kind of in a serendipitous way to something that we can facilitate happening in a still serendipitous but more maybe formalised way. So that's my definition. Any volunteers to tell us what your definition is? Or I could pick on people if you prefer.
Pick on people at the back.
Yes, I might pick on people at the back. Thank you. Hands up here.
I'm Sue Campbell from the OECD, and I would like to be a little bit provocative, I guess, because I'd almost want to take the word scholarly out of this, because one of my big takeaways from this conference has been, and I think the award winners yesterday were a real key to that, is that it's pushing the envelope, and when you push the envelope a bit, you discover that your audience is not the scholarly box that you maybe thought it was. It's been my mantra for a long time that your potential audience is always a lot bigger than the audience that you think you're talking to. And I would kind of like to rephrase that question a bit to take the scholarly out. Because I think the future is in just having conversations that go way beyond that. And I've been very fascinated by having the news media and the struggles that they've been going through in this conference too, because I think that is very helpful. So my message, well, I guess my answer to that question is let's open the box a hell of a lot wider and not be afraid to talk to everyone, because the minute you start doing cartoon posters, you suddenly find that there's a million people who've actually got interesting insights to bring in.
Yeah. Thank you, that's a great answer, and actually part of the reason why we have Helen here, so who we'll introduce in just a minute, so thank you. Anybody else like to share your definition? One more person, maybe, please? Yes, thank you. And I apologise to people on this side of the room. The light is incredibly bright, so it's not always easy to see you.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, very, very briefly, taking from and sharing with.
Perfect, cool. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go into introductions, and then we're going to talk a bit about why each of us is here, why we hope we can contribute to the conversation. I'm not going to do long introductions because part of my fellow panelists' introductions is going to be to introduce themselves more formally. But on my far left is Andrew Stammer from CSIRO, Helen Bray from Knowledge Transfer Network, and Helen used to work in scholarly publishing but not anymore, and Nicko Goncharoff from Digital Science. So we are going to spend a little bit of time. We have a number of questions. The first few we're going to kick off the answers for ourselves, but invite you to comment. After that, we're going to turn the tables and ask questions of you in the first instance, hope that you will have some interesting responses, and then pitch in with our comments on your responses. And I think Audrey knows, possibly not, Suzanne knows that at least one or two of the questions are specifically for ALPSP, so we're hoping that you will pitch in on those. Okay, so without further ado, and we don't have much in the way of slides. Some of us have done slides just for this first little bit of introduction, really. But other than that, this is going to be a more or less PowerPoint-free presentation. So I'm going to go first. As Audrey says, I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Support at ORCID, and ORCID is really an organisation that's built on collaboration and cross-fertilisation. We were founded by a group of a mixture of publishers, associations, funders, research institutions, repositories, and others who saw a need for a universal identifier for researchers. And what we're trying to do now, we're nearly 4 years old now, and we're really trying to kind of formalise the way information about researchers flows through the different sectors. So what you have here is an infographic of the researcher in the middle, using his or her ORCID ID when they interact with their publisher, their employer, their funder, and those organisations then using that validated information about the person that says, yes, I really am who you think I am, to assert a connection with their works, with their publications and data sets, or with their grants and awards, or with their affiliations, so what organisations they're affiliated with. And I should say that associations don't appear as a separate group in this infographic, because really associations often play all of those roles for their members, so that's why we haven't pulled them out separately. But since this is primarily a publishing conference, I wanted to talk a little bit about how that looks like in a publishing world. So again, you've got your researcher at the middle, and one of our kind of mantras is enter once, reuse often, and this is something that we're not there yet at ORCID, but we really aspire to. So just having a researcher enter his or her information once, or even better, have it entered for them by their organisation, and then that information flows through all the other systems that they're using. So from the researcher, they authenticate. So we're asking them to say, to sign into their ORCID account to say, yes, this really is me, as part of the collection process. The organisation, the publisher, then includes the information about the ORCID ID in the metadata that will be sent to Crossref or whoever. You also display it with the publication in the journal article, or hopefully increasingly in books. And you assert that work. So you say, yes, this person submitted this manuscript to me. We know that they are who they say they are. And we can say, we can push this work back into their record, into their ORCID record, and be really confident that we have the correct author for this particular publication. And then ideally what we want to do is we want you to then synchronise that information in your systems so that the ORCID record and whatever systems you're using have the same information, which is then allows it to be passed on to other organisations and systems that researcher is using. So I feel that ORCID, I believe the reason Audrey asked me to chair this session is because ORCID really, we couldn't do what we do without collaborating and cross-fertilising, not just within the research community, but right across the sort of the whole scholarly and broader research community. So it's not just about publishers, it's about universities, funders, and all the other players in the system. So that's ORCID. I'll hand over now to Nicko.
I think so. No.
Helen. Sorry.
Helen.
Sorry, Helen.
Okay.
I mean, I can do your slides for you.
That would be good. So I'm from the Knowledge Transfer Network, and what we are is an innovation networking company. So we're a not-for-profit, grant-funded company, and we really do what it says on the tin, or what it says on the slide in this case. We focus on knowledge transfer. We bring together businesses, entrepreneurs, academics, and funders, and that's to develop new products, processes, and services. And we're all about creating the value from those great ideas that start right at the research end. So if you think about the discovery road from basic research right through into finding innovative applications, right through into capturing value from that work, then we're probably towards the end of that discovery road. Whereas the scholarly publishers are probably a little bit further down the road towards the research end, but spanning across. So what we're doing is trying to help businesses really deliver that value and bringing everybody together in order to do that. So if we think about that road, one of the ways in which we do that is with our technical experts, we're able to spot some of the hot spots around innovation and bring together connecting the right kinds of people. So we're connecting people who have an innovation need with people who have an innovation capability, and we're doing it around particular hot topics. So that means that we have two fundamentally strong beliefs. Firstly, that progress is driven by unusual interactions. So we call it connecting the unusual suspects. We get the right people together who actually can contribute to drive something forwards, but they will come from many, many different sectors. So some of our kind of successes would be astrophysics technology from the University of Glasgow used to extend the food shelf life. Or using some kind of wheelchair 3D fabric technology is actually done using the testing kit at, around for concrete testing at a university. So they're the kind of connections that we're making. And that's obviously clearly all about cross-fertilization. It's kind of exactly what we do. The second mantra that we have, as well as connecting unusual suspects, is that we really do believe innovation is a contact sport. It's all about getting people together. Because it's only when you actually get people together that you start to build the kind of trust that you need in order to develop a relationship that means you can then take something forward. So there's two reasons why I'm here, really. The first is because I'm really interested in cross-fertilization, collaboration, want to look outwards. And the second reason is simply because Alice asked me. It's all about the people.
I think it's mine. It is. So, my name is Nicko Goncharoff. I'm with Digital Science, and as some of you know, we are a technology company serving the needs of the research and scholarly communication communities. As such, we have to, basically Digital Science, I mean cross-fertilization, I don't love the term because it makes me think of a crop dusting plane that's gone to the wrong field. But collaboration and serving multiple stakeholders is at the heart of what we do. So we address the needs of researchers, but also the organizations that support them listed. We've invested in 9 businesses to date, and our strategy has evolved, and I know because I was there from the outset when we were trying to figure out what the strategy should be. But we've had a couple of key guiding principles that we've been following, and we believe all of those are essential to the success of our customers, and thus our own success. And you'll notice, without going into detail, they all echo themes around collaboration, cooperation, cross-fertilization. The other reason that I'm here, so I mean, Digital Science, basically, without collaboration, we don't think we can succeed, and we try to be open. We're very keen to integrate with competitors or customers, partners, et cetera. So the theme there for us is collaboration is essential to success. And the other reason that I'm here is that I, this year, became the chair of the STM Reference Group on Scholarly Collaboration Networks. This is a cross-publisher initiative designed to deal with the issue of article sharing. It was originally chaired by Fred Dilla, who was on this stage 2 years ago, I do believe, for your award. Yes, just to embarrass Alice a little bit more. I took over from him earlier this year. The goal was to get publishers together to address in a comprehensive and measured fashion the issue of article sharing. And our first output was a set of voluntary principles around article sharing that mainly covered private sharing, that is the sharing of articles in research groups, be they on scholarly collaborative networks such as ResearchGate, academia, Mendeley, whether they were sharing between institutions and private sector partners, other intra-institutional sharing, et cetera. And those principles were published for public feedback and revised after we received some very substantive comments, and they've since been endorsed by 40 organizations. That's nice. It's good. It was good progress, and it was nice to see something about private sharing going from being very controversial at the outset amongst our 10 initial members to basically being accepted as fact. And that's good because sharing is fact. It's going on anyway. It's not like it's only controversial within publishing. The next step is dealing with public sharing, somebody posting an article on their profile page somebody posting a link to their article, an article they like on Twitter, somebody going to ResearchGate and asking for an article that's fundamental to their research. This type of public sharing is considerably more controversial and arguably does pose a greater threat to revenue streams. So in order to solve this, we have to really engage all the stakeholders, so the SCNs, institutions, in some cases funders, and of course publishers. And if we are to have some type of sustainable, transparent solution around article sharing, we have to put together an infrastructure, we have to have guidelines, we have to convince publishers to simplify their sharing policies so that scholarly sharing for researchers is not a burden. And all of that requires cross-fertilization, collaboration. And so that's why I'm here today. I do have, at some point, I think that our discussion may touch on sharing, because I think it's just such a great specific use case for why this is essential to the progress of scholarly publishing or publishing. I'm not going to go into any of these, but I'll just leave them up here for a moment. These are some of the challenges and realities around sharing that I've basically uncovered in the time I've been working on this the past 2 years. So.
And last but not least, Andrew, who has absolutely no slides, so he's going to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about why he's here.
Thank you. I did a very bad presentation some years ago, at the end of which a friend of mine said to me warmly, "Andrew, when you have nothing to say it with PowerPoint." And it's put me off ever since, I'm sorry. I'm from the CSIRO publishing. CSIRO is the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. It's an Australian-based government-owned agency. It's about $1.3 billion in its enterprise, and it has this little $10 million publishing house that I'm involved with on the side. You've probably all got a connection, actually, with CSIRO. We invented Wi-Fi. The plastic banknote that you've just adopted here in Britain, I think it came out last Monday, is CSIRO technology. And I bet that the socks that you're all wearing have cotton that has come from breeding programs that were started by CSIRO. So you all have some reason to know a little bit about it, and that's the plug. Why am I here? Personal response first. I was born in 1960 in a white, English-speaking, middle-class family. I was fortunate enough to be gifted with moderate intelligence and a Y chromosome, and I spent the first 25 years of my life cementing all the prejudices that attend that status, and then spent the subsequent 35 years trying to undo them. And what I've found in that space is that by being more open to diversity of ideas, I had a more interesting life, and ultimately it's been more successful. So that kind of goes to this very theme. On a professional level, I've danced around with various different publishing companies, and I've observed, particularly at our end of the world, which is a long way away from the centres of scholarly publishing. A former Prime Minister once described Australia as being at the arse end of the world. We struggle, or have struggled in the past, as some of the big issues of the last decade and a half, 2 decades, have washed over us. If I go back to the early 2000s, publishers in Australia were not talking to one another, and they had no common voice. But the library community was being particularly vociferous about open access. And they were saying some fairly outrageous things about publishers that folks, we had no real means of sort of responding. And so a colleague of mine, and I think of Alice's and Helen's too, Mark Robertson, you may know him, good drinking mate of mine. He approached a number of the local publishers and said, made this observation, we don't have a common voice, and suggested we do something about it. And so we approached the Australian Publishers Association, which was always keen to sign up new members, and formed a scholarly and journals committee. And we set out a plan collectively to provide a common voice. We targeted funding agencies, universities, the library community, and so forth. And we targeted them on a sort of a three-pronged approach. We wanted to do some lobbying. We wanted to do some public relations stuff. And we wanted to influence. And so we started just a series of conversations that ultimately led to the establishment of some forums that we ran over 2 separate years, 2013, 2014. These forums brought together the key players. We specifically targeted the head people such that others would then come along. And we were able to have a conversation which at the end of the first forum, one of the bit more embittered players observed, we couldn't have had this conversation 5 years ago. And so it was agreed we should have another forum. And it sort of, the themes around cross-fertilization and collaboration that came out of that experience that, and resulted in a willingness to talk within a community that had previously not been able to do that, where each party could put its own position in a neutral environment, and in which the value that each party added to the game, the ecosystem, if you like, helped bring about an understanding that allowed degrees of cooperation that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. And so it was sort of that story, and that happened over a decade and a half. I thought when Alice pressured me to participate today, I thought, no, that's something I think that's worth sharing, so that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Well, I hope you'll agree that we bring a variety of different perspectives to this topic, and as I said before, we really want to hear from you because you all have different perspectives as well. We're going to start with a couple of other questions for the panel that we'd like you to contribute to, and first of all, we kind of want to go big. So we're here to talk about scholarly publishing, or maybe not just scholarly publishing, but actually we're all here to serve the research community. So my first question is, how and why does cross-fertilization help research?
If I can pick that one up, and I'm going to refer here to some work that's been done by my colleagues in CSIRO who are researchers, so this is not necessarily a publishing example, but we have quite a large ecology division. And what the ecologists have found is that when they engage with indigenous communities, Australian Aborigines, that the ecological patterns and explanations that the researchers come up with to explain the Australian environment are almost identically matched by the traditional stories that the indigenous people tell. Now, those stories have been developed over 30 to 40,000 years. And what the researchers find is if they go to the stories first, they get a much better understanding of the ecology of the place without actually having gone out there and done very much about it. And so their research is actually speeded up and given a depth of understanding that and an alternative understanding that they wouldn't otherwise get. Being a rapacious publisher, we then tap into that, and we've published some books in this area in which we've put the science perspective, an Aboriginal perspective, and we've overlaid that with an artistic perspective as well, and sort of big, four-colour, beautiful books with a lot of traditional artwork in it. And they've been very successful. They've sold well. And I wouldn't initially have connected those elements of what was going on, but there was wins in it for all parties. And I think the research was made better off as a result.
Thank you.
Me? All right. So article sharing is at the heart of research, and it's, Andrew, something that you said that reminded me of, I've been in a lot of meetings with the STM reference group, and some of them have been quite contentious. And because Digital Science is not a publisher, I was able to take a fairly neutral position. And I recall we had the head of an SCN attend one of our meetings, and it was 10 society and commercial publishers. The name, IEEE, ACS, Elsevier, and et cetera. And this gentleman came in and started to lecture the publishers on how they should all transition to open access in 3 years, and thus article sharing will become a moot point. And he basically told us that we were all meeting and wasting our time. That was an interesting meeting. People were, I spent a lot of time calming people down because in digital science, we interact with people who have those views all the time, and successfully in some cases. What that led to, though, was this person came back to a few more meetings, and his position moderated, and the publishers opened up a bit, and just what you said, although it was over a much shorter period of time, you started to see, this was one of the reasons that private sharing became no longer controversial, so that if any of these organizations sign up to the voluntary principles, at least sharing in groups now is not an issue, right? These publishers are saying, I don't really care what you do as long as the organization you use follows these guidelines. Now, that hasn't taken hold that widely, and notably ResearchGate and academia.edu have not signed up. But Mendeley, a host of other SCNs have. And that means publishers are no longer going to get in the way of researchers freely sharing articles, which is a huge advantage for them. And I'm hoping that that same cross-fertilization of opinions and attitudes, and the softening of attitudes, and the understanding of different perspectives can lead to similar progress on the knottier problem of public sharing, which I think can, if we can address this, would be a huge benefit to researchers.
I think we'll ask the audience, don't you?
I was going to do that after you'd had your share. Fine. Anybody in the audience, do you have experience of how cross-fertilization in your organisation, or maybe outside it, any examples of how this is really helping research? Yep, somebody at the back. Suzanne, even.
Hello, I'm representing Twitter. There was an observation, we put a shout out just to say any thoughts. And David Smith from the IET just said that he feels that cross-fertilisation is walking in someone else's shoes. And I just think that was quite interesting when you think about it in terms of researchers. So I just wanted to feed that back to you and see if the panel have any thoughts on that perspective.
Thank you, Suzanne. Does anybody want to respond to that? Giving the audience a little bit more time to consider whether you have any examples that you'd like to share of cross-fertilisation helping research?
I think it is walking in other people's shoes, but it's also walking together with people in a slightly different direction from the one you intended to take. I don't quite see it as quite a fundamental. I see it, people go around a roundabout together and work out which exit to take.
I would agree. It is, but it's not exclusively walking in somebody else's shoes. I think that it's important to recognise that there needs to be a win for all of the parties at some point. That's not necessarily at the same time, but if there isn't, one is asking people to give stuff up in these sorts of interactions, there has to be a quid pro quo for that. And so yeah, walking in their shoes for a period to get a sense of what's in it for them and what's the world look like to them and what do they need. But then I think you can, in a more informed way, retreat to your original, to your position, and it's then finding where the matches are.
I don't know whether Kathleen Fitzpatrick's still in the room, but hi Kathleen, I just want to say actually, of course, your example, and in fact the whole session before this there was some great examples of collaboration and cross-fertilisation, but certainly what you're doing with MLA Commons and the Humanities Commons, I think is a really excellent example of cross-fertilisation aiding research.
I think so, and thank you for saying so. We're also looking outside of the community of scholarly societies for other kinds of cross-fertilizations. We adopted the model of MLA Commons, of the Commons in a Box layer that we built on top of, from the City University of New York's Graduate Center, which had used that same technology to connect its campuses all across New York City. And we thought, this is a great model for getting a very dispersed community with common interests that doesn't have the ability to talk together in person into communication with one another. And so we borrowed that model from them. Similarly, our partners at Columbia University, who've been running their academic commons, which is their institutional repository, were able to serve their constituency in a way that we thought we could borrow from and learn from. And so those relationships with their university partners have been really fertile for us, and have also given those universities inroads into thinking about how scholarly societies are serving their faculty and what they can learn from that.
Right. Thank you. And I think, yes, Susie.
Something that is facing many disciplines as well as publishers within those disciplines is the ability to go to publish and to communicate in print or online in one another's communities. It's very difficult because the system is set up so that you get credit for publishing and communicating to your own community. Impact factors are also identified as such. And Bio1 established an open access journal to study precisely the effects of global warming, so the effects of the Anthropocene, which is now, by the way, a formal era. It's just been voted on. And to study this, you can't just look at ecology or ocean science or atmospheric science. You really need to bring them all together, including the human sciences, social sciences, humanities, the entire spectrum. So what we did, and it evolved, I have to say that it wasn't entirely intentional at the first, was to bring together 6 domains, from sustainability engineering to human aspects, as well as the public, outreach to the public, and of course the ecology and geophysics, etc. And what happened was the editors-in-chief of each of those domains, who hadn't necessarily worked together, they might have known of one another, began to work together. And by doing that, they were encouraging papers to come from many disciplines, which were then sponsored, shall we say, by several of these domains. And what evolved from that has been a focus on special features, which run the gamut of all of the different domains. And it brings people together talking about something that can only be addressed when you're bringing in everybody. So it's a very difficult thing to do because the system is set up to actually mitigate against that kind of interaction.
That's actually a great segue into our next question, and also reminds me of another quote from the session before this, which I think is very pertinent to this session, which I think Leighton said, our collective knowledge is hugely powerful, and I think that really speaks to the need and the value of collaboration and cross-fertilization. So moving on to this is the last official question for the panel before we start throwing more things your way, so be prepared and please don't all walk out. Or we can just have a conversation between ourselves. So the last question for all of you is, what are the barriers to cross-fertilization and how can we or are you helping to break them down?
Okay, I'm going to start. So rather than think about the barriers, I was starting to think about the positive conditions that we needed to create. And I think that, let me take a step back and say, I think we all have a love-hate relationship with the word open. But open innovation is no different. So there is, in the same way that demands for open access, open peer review, open data, also clearly demands for open innovation. That's a really high bar, and it may or may not be effective for everybody. If you're going to have open innovation, you're going to need to have a common agenda, common goals, as you said. You're absolutely going to need buckets of trust, and you're really also going to need to have sorted out your IP issues first. So open innovation is a really high standard, but I would ask us the question about What do we need to do in order to be open to innovation? And I think that's really important, which is why I have shown you a picture of my washing line. So, so my point here is that this, I think we should all strive to become the kind of T-shaped people that we've heard referred to for maybe the last 25 years. So a T-shaped person clearly has a very deep knowledge of specialist areas, but also is concerned about building a knowledge broadly. So becoming a T-shaped and really understanding as much as possible about other areas and about other spheres. So actually, when I peg out my washing, I don't want to see lots of red, skinny T-shirts. I want nice broad ones. I want a nice broad red one, a nice broad yellow one, and a nice broad green one. And I really, really want that yellow one with the great long arms that can reach out and mix in with all the other washing. So I think this is all about diversity of knowledge. It's about diversity of experience. It's about diversity of thought. And that's what's going to overcome any barriers that we have. That's what's actually going to drive collaboration and innovation forwards. So I think we have to question for ourselves, do we actually belong to T-shaped organizations? Are we T-shaped people? How can we make that happen? And actually, where are the helping hands that will help to facilitate that?
I think if I go back to a period in history, I do that a lot. I must be coming up to close to a retirement or something. There was a time some years ago when the Australian dollar was worth 48 cents US. And then in the last few years, it got up to being worth $1.08. And we export a lot of journals. And so we went from a period of extremely good times to a period of considerable leanness. I think good times can be a barrier to collaboration. It's comfortable, it's pleasant, there's no real pressure on you, and yet it's the time when you've got the resources and probably the space to actually look at what your options are and think about, should we be making some change? So I do feel that there is it's a mental barrier, but when times are good, one really ought to be looking at what are your options and how are you going to cope when things change and are not so good, because it's a lot harder, I think, in that circumstance. I have a good friend, some of you may know, Chandy Pereira, runs Typify, a company that provides a layout solution. He tells me that the company is about 15 years old now, I think it is, struggled in the first 5 years, and then around about 2008, he was getting calls from CEOs of very large companies who were in a difficult situation. They had to find alternatives to the way they had been publishing. And it was then that that company took off, simply because folks were forced into doing something different. What I try to do for myself is, when times are good, be a pessimist and think it's not going to last. That's the time to really start thinking about collaborating.
I'd like to go back to your point. I think that collaboration, cross-fertilization is absolutely dependent upon identifying the win-win. And that's difficult to do when you don't necessarily know what the outcome will be. You may not even know necessarily why you've been thrown together. And I'm going to keep going back to the article sharing because I like specifics. I don't want to talk about anything too vague. So if I get boring, you can just boot me off the stage. I've also gotten quite passionately wrapped up in that. But you know, when you're sitting down and you have platforms that have a lot of publisher content on this side, and they're saying, well, we already have it, so why should we work with you? And there are publishers here that are saying, well, you're infringing our content. Why should we cooperate with you? And that leads to the win-win is, well, we can sue you and make you stop, or we won't sue you. And that's not really a win-win. But getting both sides to understand that, you know, publishers can offer a hell of a lot to platforms. I mean, you can have a complete set of high quality metadata right? Better than, no apologies, but better than cross-ref. If you're working directly with the publishers, you can have access to related content that the platform couldn't possibly get. And that means they could serve their researchers better. But getting the platform to accept that that's worth it for their end user, getting the publisher to accept that they have to release some control over their content, it's tricky. And we're working to define what the mutual wins are. I'm not pretending I know for certain. I have some opinions, but my opinions won't sway the entire publishing community, nor SCNs that are backed by tens of millions of dollars in funding. So it's an iterative process, and I definitely consider that the biggest barrier.
I think you make a good point there. We heard earlier this week, sorry, I can't remember her name, the woman from the Wellcome Trust, the researcher, who gave us the list of things that really annoy her about the publishing process. And I think it was 3 or 4 on the list was, she used the expression, you need a wet signature from all of the contributors of a paper to say that this article is, there are no conflicts of interest. And then the next day I'm sitting in the rights session, which Susan from the PLS chaired. And I'm sorry, Susan, my mind's just gone blank on your surname, but I thought it was a fantastic session. I got a lot out of it. And the exhortation to get those signatures and how important that was, and you're positioning your business well if you do and not well if you don't. You've got the tension of those two extremes. How do you solve that? Well, you've got to have a conversation, which goes exactly to your point.
I'm really interested in what you say, though, about not necessarily having a clear outcome for the collaboration, and a clear goal and a clear vision. I'm really interested that people would kind of collaborate for collaboration's sake versus collaborate in order to achieve something together.
No. It's to solve a problem. Yeah. The problem is to enable article sharing in a way that all researchers get what they need and publishers don't go out of business. That's the clear problem, right? But how you exactly get there, no group of publishers can fully understand what ResearchGate's and how ResearchGate best serves its users. That is determined by the users and by ResearchGate, for example. So the only way to figure out a tenable solution is for all the parties to sit down and work out what that solution looks like. But the end goal is clear. It's just I guess I get too focused on the details, but the win is that everybody can share articles, but that's too vague, right? That's not. It's defining the specific benefits that each party will get from it. And we're working toward that, but without sitting down and exchanging ideas and having some points of contention, you don't get there.
Okay, so your turn now. Does anybody have any experiences or any views on what you think are the biggest barriers to cross-fertilization, either in your organisation or in the industry more widely? Audrey.
I think I spent a lot of time with a lot of different opinions around the table. And for me, I think the biggest barrier is people who are willing to talk at the other people around the table rather than to them, and are completely unwilling to move anywhere from their very entrenched right or wrong position. And they're the ones that I think are the barrier, and it's do we go around that barrier? Do we go over the barrier? Do we embrace the barrier? That's the big thing. That's the sticking block, and it's usually a very small vocal minority, and everybody else is willing to kind of get around that block, but the block is still there, festering, for want of a better word.
I don't think it ever goes away, too, but we've, because digital science, across all of our companies, we have a lot of people who like us and some people who hate us. And when we did the article sharing on Springer Nature with ReadCube, on Nature at the time, people personally attacked me and Timo. That was the worst thing. I don't mind a few insults, but don't mess with my guy. And one of the people who was most disparaging in his comments, has attended numerous digital science seminars since, and he's been brought into the fold, and he still clings on to his most extreme opinions, but he doesn't hate everything we do, and we're learning something. I mean, he has some valid points, a few, about the needs of researchers. And so we're learning a bit from him, and the main thing is that the level of antipathy has dropped a bit. There are some people I think you can't bring into the fold, but you always have to try. That first meeting I meant with the head of this one platform versus 10. I mean, the scowls on everybody's faces as this guy blithely went on and said, "Look, your revenue source is going to be dead in 3 years anyway. I don't understand why we're even talking about this." I mean, that's quite insulting, right? And he was incorrect, and he's starting to see that now. So it takes some awkward meetings, and maybe even enduring some bouts of nausea to get through it. But I think it can be overcome in some cases.
And that's actually, thank you, because that was not set up at all. I'm sorry, Phil, I'll come back. Yeah.
At last. I cannot believe it's taken this long for you to join our conversation.
The question was about barriers to cross-fertilization and to collaboration. So I think one of the interesting things to me over the past 20 years of the history of our industry is that scholarly communication kind of oddly ended up in a kind of a overly siloed environment. So, for example, and rather perversely, I think the internet kind of caused this to happen in a way. Researchers were no longer had to go into the library in order to obtain content because it was available through site licenses on their desktop computers. And as a result, there was a less of an opportunity for librarians to interact with researchers in that setting. So there was less contact there. And then I think also publishers and librarians had to struggle to make sure that they continue to meet face to face, and with electronic communication being so prevalent because of the internet. And so we've now kind of reached this status where we're thinking to ourselves, we need to be more collaborative. We need to make sure that we kind of rebuild these connections and understand the needs of all of the various different stakeholders. And I think that the ALPS conference this year has really shown how some of those ideas are really coming to the fore. We're learning more about how the way that founders and institutions are assessing research, in a way that we weren't having those conversations, several years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think this is terribly positive. I think we're coming out of a period where the barriers were rather perversely created by it being too easy to communicate in a kind of an odd way. That's
a really good observation. In the article sharing work, I find myself trying to explain to people who don't like publishers what value publishers bring, and I'm not a publisher. But I had 2 machine learning software startups, and machine learning software depends on human curation to get accurate models that have predictive power. And so early on, I really appreciated how valuable and expensive human curation is. And people take publishing, especially scholarly publishing, for granted. Mm-hmm. They get all this content, and they say, well, it should all be free. And if it were all free, how would you'd never find the good science. It would be hidden. And anybody who tells you that sophisticated AI keyword search can find things that editors never will has never worked in an AI startup, and certainly hasn't founded one and depended on it to put food on his or her table. So you're right. Like, the value of publishing was really clear, and then with the internet, it's been obscured, and clarifying that value is actually key to cross-fertilization, because it then gives people incentives to work together, because there's the win-win, right? If you understand the benefit that publishers bring to SCNs or institutions, then it's easier to see what the positive, the benefit for oneself is.
Okay, well, we have a sort of somewhat nice segue into the next question, which is for all of you in the first instance. So one of the things that I think has really come out of this, your answers and your contributions to the last question, is one of the barriers can be people, one way or another. So how do you get the right people around the table? So to your point, Audrey, you know, maybe part of the challenge that we all perceive is if you don't get the right people, and this possibly applies to you as well, you know, you create barriers through having the wrong people there, or you just don't have the conversation that you really need to have, because not everybody who needs to be represented is represented or feels able to speak or whatever. So I know there are people in this room who have experience of trying to get the right people around the table to talk about stuff, and we would love to hear from some of you. Francis. So there's a microphone just coming.
My experience of getting the right people around in a room has been many and varied. And one experience came to mind where I got Larry Lessig in a room with Elsevier's chief legal counsel. That was quite an experience of getting two sides together. But I think some of the comments about persevering are really important, because when I set up Knowledge Unlatched, I was kind of a football between the library community and the publishing community. Because when I first launched the idea, people said, librarians said, publishers won't do this. And publishers said, librarians won't do this. And I just shuttled diplomacy, my God. I was going back and forth and back and forth. And eventually, it worked. People now accept it. So, if at first you don't succeed, just keep on trying. Yep.
Any other comments? Yeah, at the back. Sorry, Adrian. Leslie. Oh, sorry, Sabia, there's some, Adrian as well. You've got to. We do the person at the back first.
From Cabby. My feeling very much on this is that it comes from the top. If your CEO or your CIO appreciates cross-fertilisation, then that will filter down into the company. And if they don't, then that will also be a huge problem within your company. Certainly it's very much encouraged where we are, and we speak to lots of other companies doing similar things, and that often doesn't lead to anything, but every now and then it leads to something really good. So for me it's that top-down pressure that gets you to do things.
Adrian.
Hello. So Alex, it sort of makes me think of something we're involved with SSP. Sorry, the SSP has a fellowship award where we award early career grants, and we pair them up with mentors. So we have 12 experienced sort of mentors working with early career students, and we're really facilitating the transfer of knowledge on both ways. The mentor learns so much, and I don't know if Isabel's here from OUP, but we've sort of encouraged some of these mentees and fellows to come to these conferences and share and interact, but they bring with them that sort of new novel knowledge. The session we actually put together on Thursday morning was really started by some of these mentees saying, I don't communicate via email anymore, I use WhatsApp, I use all these different programs. And the thought was, well, how do people engage with people like that if the new up-and-coming people are using new technologies and different things that we're not in tune with? So, just an example.
Yeah.
Sounds like Isabel may have a response to that.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to be here. I was only going to comment on that in that I've learnt, I think, more so my job is actually like reading everything that I possibly can all the time. So I learn a lot every day. But I feel like I've made leaps and bounds in how much I've learned by being to the 2 conferences that I've ever been to. And I also want to say that it's sort of like being in a sweet shop of new ideas all the time. And I find myself being swayed one way and the other. And I think that's fine. Like one moment I'm thinking that's definitely the way forward or something. Next moment I'm thinking the opposite. And I don't actually ever have a problem with thinking that, because at some point you'll settle on the one that is the big way, but you have to fully appreciate the full advantages as far as you possibly can of the 2 conflicting viewpoints in order at one point to find which one you think is best.
Thank you. And I would just add to that I think trust is a hugely important component, and I think this came up earlier, but I think, you know, building those personal relationships so that you can bring people together who, you know, don't agree on something, but they trust you enough that they're willing to have that conversation is to me one of the things that can really help break down the barriers and help get the right people in the room.
But also maybe just taking a step back, and it's great to bring in new ideas, as you're clearly doing, people that are learning new ways of thinking, so that the whole kind of industry doesn't become stale and the kind of echo chamber effect. So, and having stepped out of publishing a year ago, I'm going to be a bit contentious now and say I had forgotten just how defensive it all feels and how entrenched it all feels. And when I compare and contrast that with some of the stakeholders across other industries that I'm now interacting with a lot, it makes me feel sorry for all the hard work that you're all doing to try to collaborate, but starting from very entrenched positions. And I think right across that bringing in, and I'm not saying that therefore all of the onus is on publishers to do something different, but actually bringing in perspectives from other industries, from other thoughts, other knowledge bases that really understand other ways of doing things and have lived in different environments might give a bit more vitality to that old slog, which clearly the perseverance is critical. And it's not, my criticism is not of you, it's just a reflection of mine coming back to hear where publishing is at a year on.
I'm not sure. Defensive is fair. Defensive is fair, but I actually think, in my experience, that if you put the different people in a room together, just like Francis, you were saying that librarians said, oh, publishers will never do this, but actually if you put reasonable people in the room together, you find there's more agreement than you would have. When we did the voluntary principles, one of the things was, well, how many articles can be shared? And as a software person, I said, unlimited. And one of our more conservative team said 3. And that's not a user-friendly answer. And so, but eventually we did get there. And when the voluntary principles came out, well, what we said was the amount of articles that would be shared would be commensurate for the discipline, which means in biology you might be sharing hundreds and hundreds, whereas in theoretical physics, only 6 people actually are in the field anyway, so what does it matter? You know there's 40 papers total. That's a joke at the expense of Daniel Hook, our managing director. I'm sorry he's not here to bridle at it. But I think that we have to be a little bit careful. Yes, there are some defensive and entrenched attitudes, but people are more open to change. It's just that you have to give them, one, an occasion to think about it, and 2, maybe an incentive also.
And a sense of urgency.
Yeah, but also I think...
Nicko's not convinced by the sense of urgency, but yeah, whatever.
A sense of urgency, and I think if you're going to collaborate too, and this is following on from some of Isabel's comments, I think you have to be free to make a mistake or 2 along the way. You can't do this type of work without making errors. When we published the first principles, some institutions were fairly savage in their response, but they were right. They basically said, again, assuaging some of the more conservative members of our group, we said, well, you can't share articles with the general public. And immediately institutions and some other research institutes that worked in clinical trials said, well, we have people who sign up from the general public for clinical studies. How can you possibly say that? This is antithetical to the principles of science. You're cutting out a huge swath of the populace. And we thought, we didn't mean that. We just thought general public seemed a bit permissive because it means anybody could have it. But the general public language went in there in the end.
I want to pick up on Nicko's comment there about getting the people in the same room, and Francis's observation about being battered back and forth. This possibly preempts your next question, I'm not sure, but we are in the same room now, and I think that goes to the importance of groups like ALPSP. They provide us with a forum in which there is a safety, or there is some rules around which we are allowed to have these conversations. And I think that's really important. So well done you.
And that is indeed.
Oh, that provoked a hand going up rather sharply. I think it's Michael. Behind you, Michael.
Hi. I bring to this my experience of the Finch group. And it seems to me that one of the critical aspects of the success, if that's what you think that the Finch group was, but the success came actually through, I think a key part of it was having a facilitator who was trusted by both sides. Well, no, not both sides, all sides. And who was prepared to put in a hell of a lot of work into understanding by probing what the key issues were for the different parties. And that's intellectually bloody difficult. Yeah. And it does take a hell of a lot of work, and it takes a formidable intellect, actually, as well as lots of diplomatic skills. But I think that actually having a neutral person who is prepared to put in a lot of time to doing that negotiation between the different parties is absolutely critical when you're in potentially conflict type situations.
Thank you. Okay, well I don't think there's any other questions. Oh, so, I'm sorry, Susie.
I was just going to take off on the comment earlier about coming from the top, and which also applies to what's being discussed right now, and that is, once you're able to foster a situation where there isn't that grip, that ownership, the need to own something, that's mine, and I'm not going to, but that's, and that need to control, it's a very human reaction to anything new, I'll grant you that. But I've found personally that when I'm able to let that relax a bit, then things start to work, start to flow a lot more easily. Yeah. Not that it's easy.
So we do now have a couple of questions specifically for Audrey, but also actually for the rest of you, because you're all, most of you are your organisations are members of ALPSP, so it would be interesting to see what you think. But we would love to know how ALPSP and organisations like this can help facilitate that kind of cross-fertilisation, and also how and whether you should do so collaboratively between the different industry organisations.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point that has, from my perspective, emerged over the last few years, that just what the differences are in the industry organisations from an outside perspective, and I mean from a non-publisher perspective. And as we're, as a resource team, relatively small and perhaps less visible than some of the other associations, I've started to be quite surprised initially as to why folk were coming to ALPS to ask our opinion, to ask us to get involved, to ask us to talk to our members. And although we have a wonderful, fabulous membership, it's full of much smaller players than some of the other trade associations. And I think it goes back to this morning's conversation in the plenary and what was said at the back. There's a perception that there's a different culture in societies and not-for-profit publishers. But it's that, but it's also that we have such a broad depth of membership. It's not just publishers.
it's all those who work around publishers. So we can bring in so many different perspectives to the table. It's not just getting the scholarly publisher, the commercial publisher, the trade publisher, whoever else you represent, around the table. We can bring in platforms, we can bring in consultants. People come to us, we need legal expertise. Who knows about legal stuff that's relevant to publishers? You know, we can get those people together really quite easily. And I think I have the perception that the outside sees us as more open to collaboration because there's just so many different types of members that we have. And we also have much less challenge when we have committees around commercial sensitivities because there's so many different people in the room that so many different conversations and we can come up with different ideas. So that's my perception. I'm no longer surprised by it, I'm quite chuffed by it.
Any comments from anyone? So the second part of the question was whether you could and should be collaborating more, working with other industry organisations to facilitate cross-fertilisation.
We are trying. That's a very short answer. We are trying. I think some of the organisations, who are probably in the room, see us as kind of their little brother or little sister at sometimes, rather than a big player at the table. And that's fine. But I think we have a lot more to offer them perhaps because of the different types of members than they perhaps appreciate.
And can I ask, what about cross-industry collaboration?
That's much easier, actually. I'm sure those who are regularly in meetings with me kind of get fed up with me going, can we all not just come to the table and talk about it? Why are we just, like, can we just not? And so it's a bit of a mantra of mine. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday about something that we just would like to do, and I'm going, if you do it in that manner, it's going to be problematic, but how about we do it in this way? It's the same conversation, it's talking about the same things, but just from a different standpoint. And I just think from that you'll come to a completely different, or achieve where we want to be in a much quicker way than just having this kind of, we want you to do that, and like, well, we're not doing it because it's too expensive, and come at it from a different way. Let's figure out how we can get to where we need to be collaboratively, pretty much how Nicko's done the STM and SCN networks.
That's a question of Phil.
Right now.
You're never unamplified, Phil.
Well, you know me, we're very quiet individual. Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me is it's really important to show willing to participate in conversations. You know, go to other people's forums. You know, it's having your own blog is great, but commenting on somebody else's is even better. You know, it's go to their space and listen to them and learn their language. And when you have conversations, frame your responses and frame your participation in their language. You know what I mean? So if you're talking about the same issues, but using different frameworks, understand how they think of the problem and participate in that. And when you show that kind of willing, you find that people then are prepared to do the same in response. And that's, I think, how you get a lot of these conversations really going, and that's how you find that middle ground.
I think with conferences, though, and associations, you have to be a bit careful because you may, in the service of cross-fertilization, invite somebody to speak or have a session that seems to the membership completely irrelevant to what they do. I mean, my example is when we get a consultant in that compares us to Google. Well, that's just a waste of my time because we are a group of 200 people, and sure, we could learn best practices from Google, but a company that maybe is, several thousand% more relevant to us in terms of structure, size, goal, ambition, and resources would be more helpful. So, and everybody can think of keynote conferences they've gone to where, not ALPSP, but I've gone to keynotes where somebody from Oracle is speaking, and I'm thinking, well, but that really, honestly, and truly has nothing to do with us, unless you're trying to learn how to run a legacy software company, and I mean, maybe there is something valid because Oracle is getting snipped at from all sides by startups. So, but rarely do people come in and talk about that. So I think that's a potential pitfall with cross-fertilization. You may have the best intent, but you need to clearly establish why you're bringing these different people together.
Which comes back to the facilitation point, doesn't it? That actually having somebody who understands the agenda and what can be the goal is really important.
Yeah, no, that was a very salient point.
It was.
The reason we asked this question was, I suppose, partly because we think maybe there is more that could be done by the different industry organisations collaborating with each other. And, you know, obviously, to some extent, you're competitive as well. You know, you're, to some extent going after there's overlap between your membership, certainly in terms of some of the larger publishers. But, you know, I think it would be quite an interesting thing, again, going back to this, our collective knowledge is hugely powerful idea. You know, there's an awful lot of knowledge and expertise across all different functions and all areas of our world within our own industry organisations. And to Helen's point, you know, when you start looking outside of that to the kind of the ones that border scholarly communications, there's a whole lot more. So if there was a way of tapping into that, I think it could be really powerful. And I know you've got your hand up, but just while you're waiting for the microphone, I'm going to say one other thing, which is, and this is a little bit of a shameless plug, I apologise, but one of the ways that ORCID is hoping to try and tap into this kind of, you know, being more collaborative, encouraging cross-fertilisation is through Pidapalooza, which is an event that we're co-hosting with Crossref and DataCite and the California Digital Library to bring together organisations that are working on persistent identifiers, which I know are not the sexiest thing in the world, but hopefully we're going to change that. But the idea is that, you know, by bringing people together who are using all different sorts of persistent identifiers for all sorts of different things in one place, we can really kind of move our game forward. And a sort of a sideline, I'm not saying that ALPSP should do this, but a sort of possible side, maybe benefit isn't the right word, but if it's successful, we're considering making this an annual event that would replace our own individual conferences, so that instead of having several smaller conferences, we'd have one big persistent identifier festival every year. So again, I'm not saying that ALPSP should be doing that, but I'm just, that this is our way of trying to think sort of cross-organisationally and more broadly about how we can work together to encourage cross-fertilisation, and it would be great to see organisations like ALPSP doing the same, I guess.
And just as an example of how powerful cross-fertilisation, just even within an industry, can be, in the UK, an organisation was set up called UK Music, and it brought together some of the really, really big music representative bodies around one table. And it's representing around about 2 billion industry in the UK. The publishing industry, creative industries, so we're talking magazines, newspapers, journals, books of all types, is about 3 or 4 times bigger than that industry. Because they have that centralised voice, they have a significantly louder and more influential voice, particularly with politicians. And I'm pleased to say there are talks to try and do something similar in publishing, but that will take longer to pull together. But it's a very clear example of when you come together and collaborate, you can have a far bigger effect than 10 individual voices all trying to say slightly different things.
Yeah. Great. Well, we have, sorry, another question or comment.
Hi, I'm Claire Hooper from Liverpool University Press, and I was just going to tell you a little bit about something that we've been doing. Some of the smaller university presses have been meeting together to share best practice, talk about frustrations, and talk about possible collaboration. It started off as a kind of an informal thing where the directors were meeting, but they thought that it would be a good idea for departments of the university presses to meet, and that's something that we do every year. You might have heard about the University Press Redux conference that we held at Liverpool in March. That was something that came out of these meetings. And I have to say personally, and I think that colleagues who come to them will agree, it's been really, really useful for all of us as smaller university presses to talk to each other. To learn about what we're doing. A lot of us are at really different stages of well, some of us are really small and some of us are a little bit bigger, but it's been something that we found absolutely, crucial.
That's brilliant. I think that's a great example, real life example. Yes.
Shameless plug. Just a shameless plug. But the proceedings, or at least some of the papers that were presented at that Redux conference that Claire mentioned, will be coming together in an open access issue of Learned Publishing to be ready for Frankfurt, so look out for that.
Great. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and we do have about 3 more questions. We've obviously talked way too much, or you've talked way too much, oh my God. But I would like to just throw it open to anybody who would like to contribute anything to the discussion in the last few minutes. And if you don't want to, I will throw it open to you lot. But we would love to hear from anybody in the audience who has any comments or questions or ideas about cross-fertilization in scholarly publishing, and to the first speaker's point, I think, more widely, not just scholarly publishing, but sort of scholarly communications research more widely. Yeah, Betsy.
So as I'm sitting here listening to everybody's comments about the qualities of what it takes to, create that environment for cross-fertilization and have those collaborations, it occurs to me all of those qualities, and I don't want to be controversial here, but they're qualities of women.
Right, go on now.
So you can really tick the box here by working on the balance of genders in your organization.
We could change jobs if you'd like.
I'm kind of tempted to just say, wonderful final comment, let's leave it at that. But thank you, Betsy, that's a really, really, well, I would say that's a great comment, thank you. Any other final thoughts?
That's a pretty good one.
It is. I think. Oh, there is one at the back there, yeah.
Just like to, in a way, follow up on the last one, just to say that it's very obvious, but we should never forget the second part of that phrase, getting people together in a room, because we are all inclined, we can be a long way apart. Yeah. The technology makes life supposedly easy, but you're not going to get there if you don't get the people in the same room, and I don't mean by Skype.
Yeah.
So at some point, email ain't going to cut it, and nor is Skype.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good. Any final thoughts from anyone? No. Thank you all very much. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we've really enjoyed the session, and I hope you have too, so thank you.
Well done. Thank you.